Hello, thanks for joining me today as we go through the process of converting an existing Ivy course into an online offering. The process for this short video is to look at overall learning objectives, break those down into session objectives, and then decide how each can be best delivered. And we're going to use some dimensions to talk about that: synchronously or asynchronously, social learning or individual learning, and absorptive learning versus immersive learning. And I'll give you examples of these as we go through. It's important to note that I don't have a class here, I have a session, because we need to expand what we think about as a class into the pre-class activities as well as what happens in the class. This presentation is going to use as an example the Marketing Business Fundamentals content. And so I'll walk through just how one topic or one session was designed using screenshots from Incendies as examples. It's important to note that Learn has these same functions, and in fact I created this video using the Studio tool at home. So a traditional course outline might look something like this. We all have different ones, of course, depending on our disciplines, but there's some sense of what we want the students to learn at the end of the class. So you see 4 bullet points here, and then we might have a sentence or two that has an overall learning outcomes. What we're going to do now is break those down very specifically. So session by session. For session 1, I took that traditional course outline, looked at what I was planning to do in the first class, and created a session for that. So what will they do before the class? There are 4 learning objectives here that you see, and we're going to break those down into what they're going to do in the class. And then after the class, these are the skills, the activities, the learnings that they should be able to do when this session is over. Okay, so there's 12 activities we're going to go through here. 1, asynchronous absorptive individual. This is a video for them to watch, very short, 5-6 minutes tops. It isn't really tied to one particular learning objective. It outlines the entire session, all of the learning objectives, and explains to the students how we're going to get there. The second is also asynchronous, very absorptive, and an individual activity, which is a reading. So this is very similar to the kind of reading we would expect students to do before a traditional class at any rate. And this particular reading deals with learning objectives 1 and 2. When they finish that reading, they move on to another short video, which is a little bit of a lecture discussion that you might typically do in the first class, again focusing and with laser focus now on learning objective 1, segmentation in this case. Then they start to do another absorptive reading. This starts to introduce learning material for objective 3, which is data visualization. At this point, they would have, at their own pace, gone through a considerable amount of work on their own. And so now we move into a more immersive and social activity. So once they have read this data visualization, they've thought about segmentation, they've read about it, they've seen videos about it. Now we're going to give them an Excel data sheet that is pre-programmed to be able to create perceptual maps. They're going to use their own industry in this case, or their own examples, to change the data in the spreadsheet to create a perceptual map for an industry that they're interested in. Importantly then, they share that with their peers, and once they have shared their own map, they can create, or they can comment on others' maps. And so you see mini discussions going and questions between the classmates about different maps that have been posted. This is related specifically to data visualization learning objective 3. They move on then to an asynchronous absorptive individual activity, which is a reading, a traditional reading, and that starts to introduce the material for the final learning objective. Again, focusing on learning objective 4, there's another short video. This is introducing positioning and positioning statements. And finally, the last sort of individual activity that they do is they watch a series of commercials. I've just got one shown here as an example that takes one brand, in this case Old Spice, and shows them commercials over the decades to talk about positioning, to give them examples of how positioning may change. Once they've watched all of those ads, which is always kind of fun to do, they jump into an immersive social experience where they talk about what consumer insights they think were driving these various positionings over the decades. Again, once they post their own entry, they can then comment on other students' entries and have a discussion about that. Now we come to the first assessed or graded activity that we've seen so far, which is an individual activity to design a brand repositioning strategy. It's a one-page. It's very immersive, but it is individual. So they think of a brand of their choice, put all their learning into practice for learning objective 4, and create a one-page that then again they could comment on if you wanted to. This one I've had graded, so I have no comments available for this one. Back to the social and immersive activities. This is getting ready for the case class. So this is where most of us might have done something like this already, which is to start a discussion forum ahead of the class to get some of the basics of the case covered in an online forum. And there's two purposes for this. One is it's very social and they can learn from each other, but it also allows you to go through some of the basics of the cases before you get to the class, because the class discussion tends to be a little bit slower. So you can see the beginning of a discussion here on a particular case. Then you get to the class. Obviously, this is synchronous for most of us. It's immersive. It's very social. We've been doing this and we expect to continue to do this over Zoom, devoted to the case discussion primarily. You don't have to get through the preliminary stuff because you've done that on the online discussion forum. And so the session itself can jump right into the case decisions. You can use polls to ask them what they would do if they were the decision makers. If time permits, you can do breakouts. And these are particularly good if you feel like the students haven't achieved one of the learning objectives. Because remember, you've been able to see them as they've gone along. So you could do a breakout to sort of laser focus in on one of those 4 objectives again and reinforce the learning. Okay, so wrapping up. The challenge is not really the technology. The challenges do include things like being very, very clear about why everything is in your course right now. If you've been teaching a course for many years, there may be some things in there that are not particularly tied to a specific learning objective, and you need to be really clear about whether you want to keep that in your course or not. It also is a faculty challenge to remain engaged in the asynchronous components of the course. So as students are debating, discussing, and sharing, you need to actually be engaged in moderating and making sure that they know that you're sort of part of that cohort. And finally, just remember, it's not about the teaching. It's really about what the students are learning and what they're retaining. Thanks very much.